very warm welcome from my side. I've seen all the guests and speakers for this panel, and I'm quite excited to meet them online for the first time, actually, except of one person. Also from New York, we have two speakers from New York. It's also very exciting for us, I have to say. This second panel runs also under a group of keywords. I repeat them. That's guilt, debt, responsibility, financial instruments, risk, body, climate, education, model, and virtue signaling. These keywords came together in different stages of the planning, so you will see that some of them are more repeated, others are not so much mentioned, but yeah, this is also a bit due to the process of putting speakers in specific panels, organizing the language, etc. Good. I give you a little introduction and introduce every speaker ahead, just like Anna did at the last panel. And then there will be only very brief breaks in between each contribution. And we have a pause of 10 minutes after the second speaker, after Coleman Collins. But I will let you know that again. That debt produces feelings of guilt, and that these feelings have the tendency to control your behavior in regards to these debts, turn the whole complex of debt and guilt into a cybernetic system. Schuld and Schulden, guilt and debt, are not only phonetically related in the German language, but make for something like a proto-transdisciplinary situation. As a system, they touch on ethics, economy, criminal law, private law, liabilities, psychology, sociology, and philosophy at the same time. And it doesn't surprise that indebtedness and feeling guilty has been crucially informing our various social organizations for a very long time, up to the point of becoming its very infrastructure. According to David Graeber's famous book from 2011, at least for the last 5,000 years, starting with barter, in German Tauschhandel. His book is called Debts, the Last 5,000 Years. I think it's quite famous and well known. But the system of debt is a cybernetics forced onto everyone, but subsisting on the poor, here the indebted, their lifetime, their coercion to compensate. It's not their cybernetics, as in the title of the exhibition project. It doesn't benefit the poor, to the contrary. But just like guilt and debt seem to be able to connect everything, on closer examination, they also enable us to separate the phenomena again, to distinguish and to assign them to their respective categories and causes. And debt as a discursive topic and focus comes up and becomes political whenever one or more of its systemic implications get into crisis mode, be it a financial crisis or a moral crisis, which are two aspects more and more intertwined in neoliberal and lately digital capitalism anyhow. And since the intervals between crises shorten as capitalism progresses, none of us is without experiencing at least one of these critical moments. The financial crisis in 2008, for example, triggered a strong preoccupation with debt and its risk management, but also a lot of activism. Occupy Wall Street comes to mind. It invigorated the production of theory and of art forms, actually, which in our scenario is what cybernetics of the poor delineates. So in these moments, post-crisis, a re-evaluation of the rationale of debt and guilt takes place. Its operative narratives are reviewed. Its narrative structure is emphasized. attempts at self-activation are initiated, and possible exit scenarios out of that systemic control are anticipated. Within these processes, various and also new perspectives on the dilemma are developed, pointing to other possible spaces and testing strategies of liberation, which range from rejection to find adaptation, from consciously misleading feedback to a hijacking of the repressive financial instruments, from integration into the own life form, in the sense of a commoning, to sedation in the sense of forgetting in order to bringing its reproduction to an end. And this last notion I heard in a recent Judith Butler lecture a week or two ago, which was announced under the exact same keyword as our panel here. And her talk was very much occupied with the student loans in the US and the consequences of education becoming a marketplace. In the context of the exhibition Cybernetics of the Poor, the Connex Guilt Debt emerges through the work of Coleman Collins. He will speak as our second guest today, live from New York, and explain his project, his art work Guilt Coin in detail. Guilt Coin run as a collaborative performance with the students of the Master in Critical Studies through the period of preparation and the short but golden, as we heard, times of the actual open exhibition in the last month. It focuses on the category of existential guilt and how this could be financialized within highly technological forms of currency. Collins is an interdisciplinary artist and writer from Stone Mountain, Georgia. His work is occupied with issues related to debt, world history, and social relations, how our economic and sociocultural systems converge to produce certain realities and fictions. Recent exhibition or ongoing exhibition, actually screening is taking place in the Carré d'Art in Nîmes. The show is called Post-Performance Video Perspective 1 Los Angeles. Comans received a MFA from UCLA in 2018. He was a resident at the Skowhegan School for Painting and Sculpture in 2017 and participated in the Whitney Independent Study Program in 2019 in New York, where he is also currently living and working. The following speaker after Coleman is Niclaire Laberge. She's a scholar and professor from the US who teaches in the English department of City University, New York. And the good news is that she is becoming or already an Alexander von Humboldt Fellow at Freie Universität Berlin, which means she is moving here for a year as soon as the restrictions allow. So at least the possibility to meet in person is on the horizon, something all of us more and more appreciate, I guess.
Inka, we can't hear you. You're muted.
Okay. I'm sorry.
The horizon was the last that we heard, and we all smiled.
Did I mute myself? Good. Hey, okay, so a personal account is on the horizon, and that sounds just great. I want to mention two of her publications. The first one is Scandals and Abstractions, Financial Fiction of the Long 80s, published with Oxford University Press in 2015. I quote from the blurbs here because I cannot describe it better myself. It says, the book is a tour de force treatment of how financial logic circulated in and affected 1980s literature and culture. It offers startling insights into some of the ways financialization has altered our lives. Her latest publication, published by Duke University Press in 2019, is titled Wages Against Artwork, Decommodified Labor and the Claims of Socially Engaged Art. And it looks at, as she writes, the flip side of the problem of, I would say, over-accumulated financial capital and its aesthetic consequences. It investigates, I quote, the changing composition of labor and the changing artistic production that this reconstitution engenders. Leclerc Laberge will address artists' initiatives countering the system of debt and indebtedness that started organizing, for example, 10 to 8 years ago, contextualizing in a historic context the interrelations between the indebtedness of American artists and the financialization of the American economy. Then our fourth speaker, the first one I will introduce last. The fourth speaker is Rachel Brendle. She's an artist and writer based in London and currently teaches at London Metropolitan University. Rachel studied a bachelor in law before entering the fine arts and art history at Goldsmith College in London and later at CalArts in Valencia in the US. She has an overall infrastructural approach to the debt complex in her artistic work as well as in her writing, arriving at questions of sculpture and volume, not least through examining the bodily adaptations, the physical effects towards indebtedness, which are subtle and also part of the highly self-regulating and feedback-oriented systems that constitute our bodies and their interaction with the outside. The title of her contribution is The Erotics of Infrastructure, Sculptural Questions of Debt and Guilt, of which the first part is also the title of an exhibition project of hers, which took place at Gasworks in London in 2017, and in a second modified iteration at Kunstwerke in Berlin in 2019. The first speaker with whom we will start our panel in a minute is Caroline Brendle. She is a student from the Master in Critical Studies seminar that ran in advance to the exhibition, Cybernetics of the Poor. Caroline Brendle has a background in contemporary dance and performance art. She has a bachelor in anthropology and a master in the sociology of finance from the University of Frankfurt Main. Her interest lies in the economic complexity theory, the way the banking sector entered its own system analysis after the financial crisis in 2008, and which is a classical form of cybernetic knowledge. In her latest work, this knowledge finds an embodiment in the gaze again, which she will redirect towards itself and its artifacts, creating an operational closed system. We will be able to watch her video work, her latest work, The Gaze in the Machine, together, and then hear her talk about afterwards. This for now. Thank you very much, and a very warm welcome to Caroline Brendle.
Yes, Inka, thank you very much for this kind introduction, and also thanks all four of you and the people at the Kunsthalle for organizing this symposium and inviting me to present my work here today. So what we're going to do is watch my video, and I will provide you the link via the chat, and then we will all watch it individually. And you would need headphones for it. So I hope, that was announced. So I hope you have some ready to be used, because otherwise the sound effect wouldn't be fully displayed. So this is the link. And the video is like 6 minutes long. So let's just meet back here after it. So it looks like we're all back here again. So I'm actually now very curious about your thoughts and reactions to what you've just seen, and think that would be more interesting to listen to than what I have to say about the work. But I guess the format here requires me to say a few words now. So however, if you have ad hoc thoughts, I invite you to just post them into the chat if you feel like it. And anyways, keep these initial thoughts of yours in mind, because they're actually pretty essential to the whole work as well. So nevertheless, first of all, I'm going to talk about, or I would like to talk about the spoken fragments that you heard and what this kind of language evokes. So you hear parts of the interviews that are conducted with scholars of complexity science, which is the current form of cybernetic knowledge. I talked to them in the context of my research as finance sociologist on the rise of cybernetic models in risk management after the financial crisis. But I'll come back to that in a bit. So you hear them speak about the development of systemic risk models for central banks after 2008. So even though what you hear is this very specific expert knowledge, it easily allows to be transferred to various other domains and to make sense there as well. So this transferability of cybernetic knowledge to different systems, from maybe psychology, ecology, microbiological processes in our body, to financial markets or the spread of a global virus, is very telling and alludes to this holistic ambition in cybernetics to be a meta-science to all sciences. This also allows one to think of cybernetic language as somehow assuming a vital function in current systems, like being the air the systems breathe, or cybernetic language as the breath of these systems. Nevertheless, cybernetic knowledge also has material effects and takes shape in concrete forms, such as the calculative infrastructure built by mathematical models and the underlying quantification of what we call world. So I was particularly interested in the generative or engendering capacity of the more specific mathematical models for risk management in financial markets, in the reality they produce while operating as a means of social communication for the financial actors. Because these risk models were capable of producing something as large as a housing bubble, which turned into a financial crisis when it burst. Risk models were used as a proxy for reality and a measurement of individual risk of a financial actor or institution. The use of these risk models was grounded in a collective belief in their accuracy, while the second and third round effects of the decisions that followed this belief were not taken into account. So something like systemic risk could build up. So something which could not be grasped under the paradigm of idiosyncratic or individual risk management. Namely, the risk that resulted from the interaction of the individual actors on a system-wide level. This systemic risk remained beyond the calculative gaze of risk models at that time. So we could say we then experienced the brutal agency of the unintended third. Let's say the agency of the collectively unseen and the effects of the collective action, which was based on the pre-crisis paradigm in risk management. So this is why you see a Greek sphinx at the end of the video as some kind of metaphor for this unknown systemic risk and its monstrous capabilities in shaping social reality, at least for those most exposed to the devastating consequences of the financial crisis. The Sphinx that poses riddles beyond the human capacity to solve, while using human knowledge to generate them, is like a reification of the unintended consequences of financial action and shows its subjectification. So the socio-technical infrastructure in financial markets reached a system-wide agency. Or we could also say we witnessed the performative effects of the calculative infrastructure constituted by risk models. This phenomenon of emergence in complex systems, such as financial markets, to use the cybernetic terms, leads me to the question of responsibility for such events. So you collectively create a system you don't understand completely and you don't know how it'll evolve because it somehow becomes autonomous. And then who's responsible for what it does for its agency? So there's kind of a Frankenstein moment we're confronted with. So that's a pretty tricky question. So either we say we actually don't understand our systems, and thus we can also trace, So either we say we actually do understand our systems, and thus we can also trace the responsibility for certain developments of it. And then we could identify the guilty actors and claim reparation. Or we have to admit we actually don't fully understand how the system works and evolves, and we somehow have to collectivize the responsibility for the system's agency. And for example, devise policy measures to tackle the effects of the unintended third. Or we know who was responsible for this system's development, and because they are responsible, they are deemed systemically relevant players who cannot be held liable. So that's what predominantly happened after the financial crisis. So they did not have to bear the consequences for the risk they took, but were bailed out and saved by the state. But then if they're not exposed to the consequences of the risk they took, it was not risk they assumed. So the notion of risk is absurd in the situation of the financial crisis. So what are the implications of being systemically relevant? Does it really mean if my action has the power to impact the functioning of the system, I am free to act without consequences? Then I'm free of guilt and don't have to be liable? The functioning of the system became a powerful political rhetoric and contributed to a redefinition of notions of guilt and responsibility. Since the liability of actors could be restricted by the impact these actors had on the functioning of the system. Another reaction to the crisis was to enhance risk models by devising systemic risk models, so trying to predict systems dynamics. And here comes the cybernetic knowledge in again. Because central bankers then reached out to complexity scientists for physics, mathematics, and computer sciences to enhance the economic risk models. But that's another story, which I engaged with throughout my sociological research. But it feels like getting into the trap again of reinvesting into the calculative infrastructure and trying to reestablish the belief in it. and thereby creating a loop for this problematic development. So this is also why in the video I devise these closed feedback loops by turning the cybernetic gaze towards itself, using the intrusive gaze of a microscopic camera on the cybernetic models themselves, and thus simulating an epistemological trap. Obviously, there is more to say about the different elements of the video and the process of the artistic practice itself. However, I don't do this here, but in my contribution to the podcast series, Cyber Sounds, which was released yesterday on the Kunsthalle website, and I think Anna already introduced it, and also Inka just mentioned it. Yeah, so for today, I just wanted to offer some reflections on guilt and responsibility from the vantage point of socio-technical infrastructures. And I guess this question of guilt and responsibility is closely related to the agency of these infrastructures. And the question, is there something like systems guilt and systems responsibility? So we can maybe talk about this in the panel discussion later. But that's it from my side so far. Thank you.
Coleman Collins. And his contribution is titled as the work he's talking about Guilt Coin, which is part of the exhibition, as I said. Okay, then I would give the word to Coleman Collins. A warm welcome to Coleman.
Hi, thank you. And I'm actually really, really glad to have seen Caroline's presentation because, as you'll see, she was one of the people who worked with me on this project. And as you said, I'm in New York right now, which I think is important to acknowledge because I actually have not been able to see the show and have been working with these other people remotely, all of whom, as you said, are students in critical studies. So I really, the distance has been really strange in doing this, which I initially intended to be very interpersonal. It became that way, but not in the way that I initially envisioned. So I want to just start by, I'm going to share my screen mostly and try to toggle through things as best I can. But okay, so this is the name of the project. Let's see if I can do a full screen here. So this is the name of the project, and it's important. Let me change the view. Okay, so this is the name of the project, and actually I'll stay in this view. So I did this in collaboration with Ana de Almeida, Diana Andre, Caroline Brendel, Chandra Esser, Natalia Jove, Melanie Lin, Miriam Stoney, Leah Suderman, and Lucia Eugenia. So all of them are in Vienna, and this distance we kind of tried to mitigate over Zoom, but it was really, really helpful that everyone was so engaged. And I think that the collaborative aspects of this took on major importance. So I'm going to try to talk about this as simply as possible and as quickly as possible, because I know there are a lot of people after me. So basically, the idea starts with a concept. There's a cryptocurrency. There's a video, which I'm not going to show you, but I'll post a link and people can watch it at their own leisure. There's a brochure, there's a website, and there's a performance. And the performance was made up. These are the performers. I actually didn't get a chance to go and perform as initially intended. But these are the performers. And through it all, I felt as though we made a sort of institution that took on its own sort of life of its own. And I hope in the spirit of the exhibition can be sort of self-replicating. I also want to distinguish between these two ways I'm thinking about this, and this was actually, again, I was talking to Caroline yesterday, and kind of pinned down that there's a quantitative aspect, which is the sort of financial instrument, and there's a qualitative, affective, social thing that's going on separately. So the idea is very simple. I was actually just reading David Graeber again and thinking about how I was going to articulate this, and I'm sure other people will get into this, but we're thinking about Schuld, guilt and debt in German, the same word. And Graeber, I think what I take from Graeber is that the emergence of money is rooted in debt relationships, and not so much, there's a sort of myth of barter that he refers to, and that and what he talks about is that the money is rooted in debt and a social relationship. And so gilt coin is a sort of cryptocurrency, a financial instrument based on debt that collapses distinction between the two. And the phrase materializing the gilt economy comes up later in the brochure, and so, which is essentially what's going on. So this is kind of how things started off. I don't know how visible this is, so I'm going to zoom in. So this is my initial, I wanted to do this because this is the sort of initial thing I sent to the people who were going to participate. I said, here's an information about the project I'd like to work with you on. It's interdisciplinary artwork. And basically, this is kind of in a nutshell. The company sells the coin, which promises guilt reduction. That is to say, when you purchase the coin, you'll feel less guilty. The currency then becomes a sort of vessel for the displaced guilt. This is something that people will actually have the opportunity to buy with real money. It will exist in the world, and if people are convinced to purchase it, will accumulate actual value and fluctuate according to demand. This may not happen, though. It has no inherent value, and it's hard to get people to purchase things that can obviously be exchanged for something. But it's important for the work that it will actually exist. So this goes on. We'll come back to the distinction between existential guilt and culpability later. But this was for the performers, at the end, it's like the third aspect was the performance. As performers, you would act as a hybrid between tech consultants, salespeople, and therapists. Imagine an Apple Store employee, only with much more empathy. Your role would be to discuss the museum goer's guilt in a productive way, listening and offering feedback while ultimately working toward pitching them the coin. This is the basic setup for the performance. Yeah. Okay, so I wasn't really sure about this, but luckily enough, I had 10 people who responded to this, who were super engaged, who I've already named, and we just wrote. Basically, we had the sort of tools of the trade now. We had a lot of Zoom meetings. We had Google Docs where people wrote back and forth and have notes about what our rehearsals were like. We talked a lot about our ideas and our own personal relationship with guilt. And so here's a couple reflections. Melly's talking about how to perform the role, and we kind of everyone developed their own individual role to the role of consultant. And we kind of slowly started to figure things out. We did role-playing exercises. Then we had larger conversations about the conceptual things. And as you can already see from Caroline's presentation, we had a lot of people who were really engaged with questions of finance, with questions of economy, and things like that. So there's more. So this continues, and this is kind of part and parcel of communication nowadays. But also, it became, these are things that are really used by. We started off sort of mimicking corporate language, but in a way, we're forced to use the same types of communication devices that corporations are using, and which is why I kind of want to stress that it became a sort of institution. So I'll keep going through this. So I want to there's something that I wrote early on, which I think I wasn't really clear about, but as I get further away from the project, I think is pretty key. We talked, and then you can see it here at the bottom. So we kind of talked about, there was a question in our rehearsals about who was being represented, because although everyone's name was in the brochure, I was this sort of unseen artist. We're representing this company, we're in a museum. So the question of agency within an institution was brought up early on, and I want to just excerpt that because I think, again, when I think about the work later on, it becomes key. So this question of our own involvement or implication leads me to the last subject discussed. Just who will you be representing when you're sitting in the gallery trying to sell imaginary coins? Do you represent yourselves? Do you represent me, the more prominently named artist in this work? Do you represent the Guilt Coin organization, the museum? Like many things, it's a combination of all these. This question of how we participate in institutions where we find our own agency interests me deeply, and it's really vital to the structure of the work. On the one hand, you're participating in an autonomous way. You're being paid, you'll be named in the catalog, and you'll contractually have a piece of the artwork. This question of implication is related to why it's important that all participants have partial ownership of the work. On the other hand, in some sense, you will also be representing these other entities, the museum as an avatar for the art system more broadly, me, the unseen artist, the Guilt Coin organization, whose logo you'll be wearing, etc. Over the course of the production of the work, you may find yourself holding a certain level of ambivalence toward these structures, which I think is precisely the point. This ambivalence or skepticism is natural and can ultimately be productive. So while this discussion is a second order one, in a first order sense, we might find it useful to enact this ambivalence in the consultant role itself. There's also always a certain amount of tension we hold when engaging with institution, no matter how much we may like certain aspects of it. I think it's valuable for us not to suppress this, but instead to work with it. I guess this sort of encapsulates my relationships with art as a whole. Anyway, well, okay. So that is the sort of background. So we had these conversations, I put out this call, these performers signed up, everyone was really interested, and we had these conversations. Of course, the pandemic, so this is, so the pandemic sort of stopped this, right? So we opened for we had one day with consultations, then the museum was closed for a month, then we opened for a few weeks, then the museum was closed. I was supposed to go, I didn't go. There were supposed to be a couple other maybe elements with some paperwork, things that didn't necessarily come to fruition, but anyway. So here's the currency. This is what it looks like. It's a digital currency, it's Guilt Coin. I have it in this little wallet, and as you can see, I received like 100 million Guilt Coins. I've sent 2 transfers. One was a test, one was from someone who actually bought it, which is kind of a nice proof of concept. But so this is very immaterial, but it's something that does exist in the world in a manner of speaking. This is the brochure you might see when you come into the gallery. So I'll also, there's a link to this online, but this is the first page. It's kind of a Rousseau gesture. Like, people are born free everywhere they're consumed by guilt. There's a FAQ. That is a problem. Guilt Coin is a solution, etc. So Guilt Coin is a financial instrument, takes the form of a cryptocurrency. It's a streamlined mechanism for efficient guilt production. It is a social smart contract. It is a token. It's a thought experiment. It's an organization. It's an artwork. Here's the gist of it. It exists to help individuals reduce their guilt. For various reasons, the world is full of people consumed by guilt that is impossible for them to address. Under our current economic system, the most logical and efficient thing to do with any type of social relation is to financialize it. Guilt Coin harnesses the power of the blockchain, utilizing the logic of capitalism to provide an unparalleled mechanism for the reduction of existential guilt. So this, I think, wasn't entirely intentional, but sort of explicitly ties in with the theme of the exhibition, the sort of cybernetics of the poor, right? Using these systems that already exist, trying to turn them against themselves, and hoping to extract some sort of difference. And so I'll fast forward here. This is what it looked like. These are the brochures sitting there. It's obviously surprisingly low tech for something that's so techno fetishist. We have the box, we have the box monitors, but then this is what a consultation might look like. People sat down at very close proximity. We put up the guards. We had masks because of the pandemic, obviously, but we were really lucky to be able to do it. I think in later ones, we had to be a little further away. You'll see there's a little bit more distance, at least for appearance's sake. And then again, the video is playing here on the side, which I'll, again, send the link. And then just a quick interlude, I'll show you the website, which is in a similar sort of thing. People are born free, yet everywhere they're consumed by guilt. For most types of guilt feelings, one can address the object of guilt by a simple act of reparation. You might apologize to your neighbor for stealing his newspaper. In the case of juridical guilt, the state can compel you to pay your debt to society. But what to do with this implacable existential guilt that relentlessly haunts the world? We have the answer. Okay, so you can see the FAQ again, and these are pretty simple instructions. And if you see all the guilt coin transfers are visible on Etherscan. This is the coin. Again, this is maybe different view of it, so you can see everything that's happened. Not a lot of action, but it's there and it's real, and you can engage with it. Okay, I'm going to come back to the presentation just to finish it up. So, okay, so we have this structure, we have this coin, we have these people, we've been rehearsing, we're in person, we're doing what we can, we close, we open, yeah, okay. But what came out of it? So I want to come back to that like earlier sort of distinction between quantitative and qualitative, because it's similar to the way that we sort of collapse, that I'm thinking of guilt as guilt and debt as related, but also we think of them, one as emotional, one as an extremely financial, one qualitative, one quantitative. In the same way that the project attempts to collapse the distinction between the two, the actual artwork and the performance ended up being extremely affective, extremely qualitative. And so in these conversations, and you can see Anna there, in these conversations, although we were taking this sort of techno-optimist, like corporate role, the Apple Store employee that I mentioned earlier, we also sort of, there's the therapy aspect, and people in some cases were surprisingly forthcoming. So for privacy reasons and also for logistical reasons, especially with the distance, we didn't record, but each participant wrote reports. And this was, again, also really helpful that everyone was a critical studies student, because we had extremely good writers. And I want to say the extent to which this became a very, very collaborative project, because the end result was really overdetermined by the dispositions of the people and the skills of the people who participated. So here's the first one. The fact that we were in Austria led many to reflect upon inherited guilt from the Second World War and the Holocaust. It was quite clear that some participants were quite worried that the existential guilt they had inherited, and in many ways tended to on a daily basis, could be evaporated by purchasing cryptocurrency. For these people, they felt it was their duty to hold on to that existential guilt, and I didn't feel it was appropriate to tell them otherwise. Okay. At the bottom, this is key. It is also important to note that a stark differentiation between feelings of guilt and guilt itself became extremely important for discussions to take place. It seemed that many participants were not happy with the idea that even inherited guilt could be displaced, though they were more content to imagine a feeling of guilt being dealt with and even eradicated. Okay. This one, I guess this is supposed to be in English. Okay. So another thing is that this project also was mostly, I would say, it was mostly in English, but it was big that it was in German, and my German was a little rusty coming into this, and I think through the weeks and weeks of rehearsals, it got a little bit better, or back to my sort of previous level. So this is someone talking about a visitor talking about a palpable existential guilt of like sex-related guilt, and thinking that as a man, to really deal with sexism, it was important to hold on to that guilt, and it was a little bit you know, it was another thing where someone was worried about not having this guilt that would sort of keep him honest and with his sort of männlichen Schuld, like a way to, in this is specifically talking about sexism, but in a lot of places people felt very strongly that without guilt they wouldn't be able to live properly, right? We'll move on. So this is someone who talked about existential guilt, but mostly that there were elites who were responsible, and that he personally didn't feel any guilt, but that it was more about like the elites who controlled things, and that he felt like he didn't have sort of agency within the system, and that the best target for the cryptocurrency would be elites and people who were in control. Next this is maybe typical, where you have people who talked about okay, I'll go to the second part. So, but also he didn't want to talk about them because he didn't like the way talking about donations made some people seem morally superior. After he told me about how guilty he felt about global warming and the earth that would be left for future generations, he explained how he compensated it by purchasing carbon credits. He didn't feel guilty because he did what he could. As he showed to be middle upper class, I suggested the question about the value in money and how interesting it would be to destine some of it to address guilt as such, how that amount of money wouldn't create any waste because it would be out of circulation. He was skeptical about purchasing guilt coin because for him, it was always better to do effective things with money. He thanked me for the conversation and went away. And then this last one with, this is someone said, we started with a really relaxed conversation, and he asked me a lot of questions about the performance. And in the end, he said, guilt is the story of my life. And because we were talking so relaxed, I thought it was a joke and I had to laugh a little bit. But then after a while, he started with a very personal monologue, and it became clear to me that I misunderstood him and he really meant this. He had been born in Damascus and left during the war and had come to Austria like 5 years before. And there was an omnipresent feel of guilt that he had the ability to leave Syria and left family there, and that there's a sort of existential feeling of not deserving and not deserving his place in the world, right? And I'll go on. I think I might be close to the time, but so I'll share some links with some more of that stuff, and with the video. But so what really happened? So we set in place this system that still has the potential to become its own currency, to become something that's self-replicating, which is important for the concept of the word. We had a lot of disruptions, but in the end, we have, I think, a really kind of fascinating record of people dealing with guilt, dealing with the concept of guilt, oftentimes explicitly for the first time in a long time for many of them. So I think I'm really kind of fascinated by how it turned out and by the conversations that emerged out of the preparation. So not only with the people in the group, but also with the people in the gallery. And I'm really hopeful that we'll be able to extend it because the currency still exists. There's still this infrastructure that relates. The institution can be expanded, enveloped. I mean, it can become a lot of different things, and it is this. It has been set into motion and can reproduce itself, which is the really interesting thing conceptually for me. And in addition, we have this really intense interpersonal performance that I hope, I mean, maybe we can talk about it later, but I hope was useful and interesting for the people who participated and who visited. So I'll stop there.
Computer time says 6:22. I think we continue. I just want to read out goodbye from Doreen Mende, sorry. She was a speaker in the first panel this morning. She had to leave, unfortunately. Okay, then I think we continue, and I welcome Claire Laberge. Her talk, I read you her talk, her contribution is titled From Financialization to Indebtedness, Rethinking Art and Economy. And I give you the screen, Claire. Okay, where did still?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much to the organizers and also to Caroline Coleman for those presentations. I did change my title a little bit. I'll show you the new title in 1 second once I share this screen. But just a few notes before we start. I'm so happy to be here with you, here being New York. And as Inka mentioned, I was supposed to be and still hope to be in Germany next year. So I will be excited to hopefully be in, different conversations and gallery spaces with some of you during the course of the year. We'll see what happens. Okay, so let me very quickly share my screen here.
I think if it doesn't work,
yeah,
it doesn't work.
No.
Okay, then I would ask the technical support to check if it's.
I mean, I also sent you all the presentation as well, but let's see. It's saying because you're recording.
We can stop the recording for the moment if you want, and
No,
we try again.
I don't care. Okay, let me try it. Okay, wonderful. So sorry about that. Let's try this again. Yeah, so the talk or the title that I thought once I had put the presentation together made a little bit more sense is a quotation that we'll soon hear, which is "The way to wealth is debt, art and debt since the 1970s." And I just want to say that a lot of the details that I will provide in the talk, particularly historical details about the nature of financialization, are specific to the United States' economy. I do think that some of those qualities have been sort of exported and other, developed global North economies have come to replicate some of them. But there are certain moments in the presentation where we learned that a university in the United States once had free tuition, which in this country is truly sort of revelatory. But I know that that's not the case for a lot of countries. Okay, so thank you, and I'm really excited to be in conversation with everybody. In 1989, the American business publication Forbes magazine ran an article that sought to periodize the soon-to-end 1980s and to look forward to what kind of economic developments investors might expect in the 1990s. The article was subtitled, "The 1980s are to debt what the 1960s were to sex. The 1960s left the hangover, so will the 1980s." Looking forward and backward and encompassing both individual and corporate structures, the article declared with some prescience that the stock market would expand, that the 1990s would be a decade for a new type of business opportunity, and that opportunity could go under the slogan, quote, The way to wealth is debt, end quote. Wealth through debt would transpire on numerous levels: student debt, national debt, medical debt, and personal debt, each of which happened under some auspices of the financial industry working in tandem with the federal government of the United States. Let's start here and bring together these two genealogies, which I think we'll really see intersecting in the art world by about 2009, 2010. These two genealogies are financialization and the expansion of debt. And these two economic structures work in tandem to bring us to the moment that we are in now. What various critics have understood is the late 20th century shifting composition of value, whether that moment is diagnosed as the end of the Keynesian compact or the neoliberalization of the state. What has happened is that an emergent financial infrastructure has allowed for the increase in the price of assets without either a wage increase or an inflationary currency adjustment, both of which could have transformative social effects. In my first book, which Inka was kind enough to mention, Scandals and Abstraction, I explored the financial aspects of this economic transformation as they were mediated through American literary texts, things like American Psycho or The Bonfire of the Vanities. In my most recent book, Wages Against Artwork, I continued that work by exploring the flip side of the problem, as it were. I investigated the changing composition of labor and the transformation of artistic production that this new composition engenders. When money's price is too high, labor's price will suffer, forms of debt will increase, and that suffering has left a trace in contemporary art practices. It's in this second project, Wages Against Artwork, that the hangover from financialization and the forms of debt within the arts that it has engendered that I want to speak about today. But first, just a little bit of sort of historical background, what we mean by financialization exactly. In 1975, only 20% of Americans were invested in the stock market. By 2000, that number had reached 55%, and today it's at about 65%. As the labor market was depressed through the 1980s, stock indices rose and profit was decoupled from productive investment. As wages began their long stagnancy, unemployment increased, and Americans began going into debt at heretofore unimagined levels. Those who still had retirement plans found them in the form of self-managed retirement accounts that were invested in the stock market. Each of these discrete facts reveals some aspect of finance as the basic epistemic unit of analysis. Today, however, I want to speak about student debt in particular and its relationship to arts and activism in the United States. Over the last 2 decades, student debt has become one of the highest and most pernicious forms of consumer debt in the United States, second only to mortgage debt and higher than both credit card debt and automobile debt. Crucially, like those other forms of consumer debt, student debt cannot be discharged through bankruptcy. So what that means is however much you suffer, however poor you get, you can never go to court and get rid of student debt. It's only that and taxation in the United States that can never be absolved. Annual student borrowing in the US has increased 5-fold over the last 30 years. 71% of students who graduate from 4-year colleges are indebted, and debt levels have themselves been rising over time. The class of 2016 graduated with an average debt of about $35,000, which represented a 6% increase over the previous years. So, like financialization, the story of student debt, and particularly of student debt for artists, may be traced to the 1970s in the United States. In the late 1960s, American universities expanded considerably in subjects taught, degrees granted, populations served, and for a time, American universities became ever more radical places. I'm particularly interested in the forms of economic critique, both emancipatory and neoliberal, that this moment fostered, and in how those genealogies of this critique are still present with us today. In the 1970s, the Masters of Fine Arts program, or the MFA, began to assume its career mantle, in the sense that if artists wanted to have a practicing career, getting this degree was now much more important. At the same time, universities were becoming cheaper and more accessible. Students and Marxist political economists, for their part, saw possibilities in expanding free education and reconceiving of education as a form of labor. In one of the few issues published of Zero Work magazine, a 1970s periodical whose title was both firmly rooted in the language of labor and in a hope for moving beyond its grasp, the university was a crucial topic of consideration. A 1975 piece of this sort was simply titled Wages for Students. Based in New York and Massachusetts, the group that issued this communique argued that the work of the student was nothing less than the work of reproducing capital by reproducing a new generation of skilled workers. As such, it was not sufficient to provide free tuition, which, for example, the City University of New York had done under student protests from 1969 to 1975, as well as had the University of California. Rather, students now argued they should be waged. And here's a quote from their publication. Quote, "We are fed up with working for free. We demand real money for the schoolwork that we do. We must force capital, which profits from our work, to pay for our schoolwork." End quote. As the name indicates, Wages for Students was deeply influenced by the international wages for housework movement of the 1970s. Viewing this same historical moment of educational expansion and wage increases, neoliberal economists, including Milton Friedman and James N. Buchanan, for their own part, quote, suspected some kind of causal connection between free public education and the rising militancy of the student movement, end quote. Students should not be waged, these economists argued. On the contrary, they should be indebted. As Melinda Cooper has argued, the neoliberals sought to, quote, replace public spending on education with private deficit spending, end quote. Grants would be converted to loans. Tuition would be made more expensive. Government subsidies would be curtailed. Today, of course, in the United States, we know which vision has become more dominant. In her wonderful study, Cooper notes that even the original American neoliberals could not have, quote, anticipated how closely today's student loan market would approximate their policy prescriptions, end quote. If there is an equivalent radical organization of wages for students in our contemporary moment, one that takes the political economy of the university as its object of critique, it is the group Strike Debt, one of the many groups to emerge after Occupy Wall Street. While Wages for Students claimed in the 1970s that students are unpaid workers, Strike Debt now claims that, quote, you are not a loan, which of course in English doubles as being alone, being by yourself. Wages for Students made the demand to receive money for their schoolwork, while Strike Debt demands not to return money its members have borrowed to attend school. Quote, we owe you nothing, end quote, is another of their slogans. Again, note how an affront to capital has morphed into a more personal affront to you, the lender or the loaner. We do not know the specific discipline out of which Wages for Students participants emerge, but we do know that in the history of Occupy Wall Street and its offshoots like Strike Debt, artists have been central to the development of the movement. Why artists would found Strike Debt and why even more artists would turn up en masse to the group's meetings and actions certainly bears some relation to the Wall Street Journal's 2013 findings that, quote, quote, graduates of art-focused schools rack up the most student debt. So the Wall Street Journal is, of course, the business publication of the United States. It's sort of the American Financial Times. And they released a study in 2013 how art schools are the largest producers of student debt in the United States. It's between these two historical moments of student-based economic critique, from wages for students to strike debt, themselves so demonstrative of a changed political economy of the university, that we may locate the expansion of credentialed art practices and arts programs within the United States. Tuition has increased, but so has the number of MFA programs. As universities incubate the fine arts, as students fund their fine arts education through what will become for many a lifetime of student loan repayments, art students use the freedom of what Rosalind Krauss called, quote, the post-medium condition, but what is now more accurately referred to by John Roberts as, quote, art after art in the expanded field, to confront the political economy of the university themselves. So this is where I just want to stress that the number of MFA programs and the number of people within American MFA programs training as artists and going in debt to be artists continues to expand at a quite considerable pace. So with full knowledge of the economic scene, the number of arts graduates has increased 31% in the United States since 2020. Adjusted for inflation, university tuition has risen about 260% since that time. The increase relative to wages and accounting for gender disparity in wage rates means that in 1971, men could have expected to pay 6.2% of their income on tuition and women 17.8%, because of course, men make so much more money than women. By 2012, men would pay on average 26% of their income and women would pay on average 41% of theirs. From then until now, the gradual availability of credit for students via loans both ameliorates the difficulty of increasing tuition and exacerbates the problem collectively, as the availability of loans leads to an inflationary increase in tuition. And what I mean by that is schools in the United States peg their tuition to the amount of loans available for students. So the more loans the government and private banks make available to students, the higher the tuition goes. And that's in a sense always been the case. It's not the reverse, as so many people tend to think. Scholars and art critics alike have increasingly critiqued the MFA as a site of debt production. Critics take it as axiomatic that an art practice travels the path of what American Studies scholar Michael Denning has called a wageless life, and what artists Coco Fusco and Noah Fisher call, quote, the artist as debtor, end quote. These admonishments contain certain truths, of course. Art critic Jerry Saltz has called the MFA, quote, straight up highway robbery, end quote. But a moral critique of this situation doesn't really lead us to understand how debt affects art production and how debt affects who trains as artists and what kind of training they get to be artists. And here I just want to present a slide from the group BFA, MFA. Oh, sorry. I forgot this slide. This is the Occupied Wall Street Journal. We just had this image of the actual Wall Street Journal. On the first day of Occupied Wall Street, some of the groups put out the Occupied Wall Street Journal. So now let me just show you this slide of who is training and for what. And what you'll see here is that there are about 1,200,000 working artists in the United States. But there are about 2 million arts graduates in the United States. And really only 10% of arts graduates are working artists, which is a rather odd statistic, right? So it's not only that the number of arts graduates are increasing and the debt load, but the people do not tend to end up working as artists. So this approach to sort of following the economics of the MFA program, and particularly the debt produced by the MFA program in its relationship to art, is somewhat different from the one that the art historians Yves Alain Bois and Hal Foster have presented in their issue of October Arts Magazine about 10 years ago on the new sort of social artwork, the sort of post 2008 credit crisis social artwork. And Bois and Foster worry that if artists become indebted to the situation, they will become finite and impotential. They attend to the state of indebtedness as a constraint on critical and artistic flourishing. And for them, their concern ultimately ends in the art classroom. I mean, they call it the classroom, not the university. But I do just want to read this quote. Debt to the situation translates into a sense of responsibility. Like the artist who today finds herself in the midst of a capitalism in crisis. Nothing new there, and is compelled to make art out of a sense of pathos and guilt rather than affirmation. Aesthetic production becomes hopelessly derivative and mimetic in the worst sense of the operation. It becomes positivist rather than appropriative. And it is against this general weakness that we have thought of a fundamental question for artistic pedagogy. Naturally, many others remain buried beneath the surface. The question is how to change the classroom so that it will produce subjects, artistic, political, scientific. Some irony exists in the fact that Foster and Bois venture into the practice and structure of artistic education without noting that for most students, debt to the situation first and foremost takes the responsibility of repaying their student loans. So for them, it's quite a metaphor, debt. When Bois and Foster worry that artists indebted to their situation will produce work that is, quote, hopelessly mimetic and derivative, perhaps they have this in mind. This is an artwork made by the artist Thomas Goki, and it is called Total Amount Rendered in Exchange for a Master's of Fine Arts degree to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, pulped into 4 sheets of paper. So Goki explains of this work that he, and this is a direct quotation from the artist, acquired the exact amount of cash, $49,983, that my tuition cost in shredded form from the Federal Reserve Bank of the University of Chicago. So he got the amount of the notes that the bank had taken out of circulation. He then pulped the money into 4 large sheets of paper so that, quote, artwork becomes the act of selling this paper piecemeal for the amount of money is made out of. For example, 1 square inch costs $4.22. 1 square foot costs $607.70. For the full duration of my residency at Art Prize, this is what he made the work for, I will, quote, sit next to my art and sell it off in any dimension to viewers. Once I sell the last piece, I will have paid for art school. Too easy in its literalism and too ambitious in its demands. Total amount of money rendered in exchange for a master's degree of fine arts might be understood as a kind of ransom note. I will not make art beyond the claustrophobic horizons of my own art school loans until I'm out of debt. The work, which Goki himself concludes was a failure, did not sell. Goki then began a new project, a project he and other artists began by forming the group Strike Debt, and they undertook a project called the Rolling Jubilee. Launched to great fanfare in 2012, the Rolling Jubilee emerged as the signal project of this collective strike debt, with an original plan to raise $50,000 and use it to purchase $2 million of discounted outstanding debt on the secondary loan market. Rolling Jubilee was a phenomenal success if measured in its stated goals. And I'll be happy to discuss the intricacies of purchasing debt if people are interested in that. So the project hoped to raise $50,000. In fact, they have now raised, as you can see on the screen, around $700,000, and they have used it to purchase some $32 million of medical debt and student debt. The collective was able to purchase this debt for pennies on the dollar. That's how the secondary debt market works in the United States. Once they owned the debt, they absolved it. So they would trace the debt back to certain debt holders and call them up and say, you're free of your debt. I think the fact that this group hoped to raise $50,000 and ended up raising $700,000 shows us that there is a broad social resonance with the idea of using some money to abolish debt worth even more money. And this seems like a counterfactual. The power of this seeming counterfactual possibility should not be understated. David Graeber notes that during the 2007-2008 mortgage credit crisis, when the US federal government was willing to buy banks' compendium of junk mortgages at par, but was unwilling to rescue homeowners, people got to understand, quote, who really makes money out of nothing, the financiers or ordinary citizens, end quote. Now Rolling Jubilee offered a chance for non-financial institutions, for non-financiers, to make nothing out of money. This project required logistical research on small-scale debt buyers. It required negotiations with lawyers, and it ultimately required the incorporation of a group as a legal entity. And what I think is so interesting is when Goki narrates this now, he really speaks about it as a kind of collective art project. But this is what we find artists doing, right? Becoming debt buyers and incorporating themselves in the United States. To accomplish their task, Strike Debt had to, in fact, become a small-scale debt buyer. And from that standing, they had to interact with other small-scale debt buyers. They had to set up bank accounts, process payments online, and learn to research the integrity of various debt portfolios, which, as you can imagine, many themselves are fraudulent and filled with worthless debts. Without the expertise to navigate debt markets, the group worried that they themselves might be scammed. For example, one debt seller offered a portfolio that seemed too good to be true. It comprised federally backed student loans that would have enabled Strike Debt to cancel the loans while collecting the amounts from the federal government, because the federal government of the United States backs certain student loans. In order to learn how to discriminate between different kinds of debt, Strike Debt had to hire consultants, and indeed they had to become their own debt consultants. As the project developed, these artists and cultural workers began to undertake white-collar administrative work. Goki describes this transformation from artist to financial white-collar worker in a local vocabulary. The group engaged in what it understood as cold calling debt buyers, and this is a term that stockbrokers and other salespeople use to describe the act of calling someone unknown to you who has expressed no interest in the purchase. The group's actions, too, became oddly similar to those of the same financial industry their projects sought to critique. They incorporated in Delaware, this is the state of Delaware, the so-called Panama of the United States because of its ease of conduct, low fee structure, and lack of transparency. Goki estimated it would take 6 months to put in place an infrastructure needed to purchase a debt portfolio. It took 2 years. During the discussions that emerged while the group was doing this, they came to the common consensus that, quote, if we call this art, people will fund it, end quote. That is, a proportionally large number of Strike Debt participants were artists who concluded that labeling their activities art would generate a certain political and organizational freedom that calling them politics or activism would obviate. Like so many collectives, whether artists or activists, Strike Debt I don't think it's fair to say that they have disbanded, but certainly the Rolling Jubilee of 2012 was their sort of high mark contribution. And in the meantime, while they have ceased for the moment doing sort of such big and sort of visually and culturally resonant projects, they have produced what's called the Debt Resisters Operator Manual. And this takes up their idea of abolishing debt as an art project and asks for indebted students, indebted activists, indebted artists, whomever, to think about forming a debtors union in which a sort of debt strike on the level of collective national repayment would take social form. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there, but of course I'm happy to talk about any of this, including the technicalities, after we conclude the presentations and turn into the discussion. And anyone who has any questions also, please feel free to contact me at my email. All right, thank you.
Thank you. I think we move to our last guest, our last speaker, Rachel Bradley, and afterwards we immediately can jump into the discussion. Hi, Rachel.
Hi.
Welcome. I give you the screen, you already have it.
Okay, thank you. Greetings everyone from London. Yes, thanks also to Nina, Anna, Inka and Anke for organising the symposium in conjunction with the Kunsthalle Wien. I'm delighted to be here and be in such great company. Thank you. So I'm going to share my screen, hopefully, in my presentation, some images. Is that coming through okay? Yeah, okay.
It's still in the, I don't know how you call it, program mode. No, that's perfect.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so what I'm going to do is a sort of whistle stop
Rachel, I'm very sorry, just breathe. There's a lot of sound in the background.
Is that?
Yeah. Do you have a window open or something? Just.
Yeah. Might be my family being too noisy.
Okay, I think it's fine. I just thought if it's an open window, then we.
Disturbing. Is it still there? Might be the whirring of my computer as well.
Yeah.
I think so too. It sounds like a machine sound or something like this, rather than
the whirring of my computer. It's actually quite warm today in London, so it might be overheating a little.
I think it's fine.
Yeah. Okay, I'll try and speak louder to drown it out at least. So yes, so this is a whistle stop kind of tour of wider research that I've prepared. And I think as an artist, what I was interested in is that debt and guilt might be approached from questions raised by other disciplines, some of these aesthetic formal disciplines that pose questions of space, material, immateriality, and form that might kind of occur in certain artworks, as opposed to approaching debt and guilt from like a political theory or from an economic theory as such. And that by doing this, this might help to kind of really perceive the operations of debt and guilt and responsibility, and consider where responsibility, or perhaps more importantly, agency, might be recuperated at the level of lived experience. Okay. So I have a series of slides that I'll also be showing you as I speak. In Trio A, The Mind is a Muscle from 1968, Yvonne Rainer performs actions flowing together in a semblance of everyday movements. the tapping of toes, striding, walking, swinging of limbs and head, bending, lying, kneeling, wafting, jerking, jogging, lolling, writhing, and handstanding. Some actions seem to involve an apparatus absent from the scene. The actions exercise the whole body, but resist the body from engaging into the elongated flow of classical dance. These actions are strung together in a paradoxical flow of disjunction, articulating the body's awkwardness, its absurdity, even its ugliness. Trio 8 explicates the forms our bodies make in this accumulation of everyday action, summarily actions of unaccounted and unnamed labour. Hoovering, getting out of bed, commuting, exercising are all foregrounded into form. The body here is demarcated as formal space, a formal space in time determined by the length of the piece, but also a space of volume in the explicit actions of Rainer's body, and the implicit space of expression interlocking with the recognizable context of these actions. The place which we recognize the wider context from which these actions take form, perhaps the imperative of these actions, is duly warped under Rainer's treatment of them. On a formal entrance to this work, what is striking is its address to attributes of sculpture, the body's relation to form, to volume, to time and space. In this work, material is cited explicitly within the performer's body, but also implicitly within the actions which take place in all our bodies, within the totality of a superstructure, and the labour this requires from us in order to survive. What is the body in credit? Is it the body free from these types of activities, or is it the body in full health? Conversely, is everybody who is not in this type of credit equally indebted? Merleidement Ukele's maintenance art piece from 1969 puts the body of labour in direct relation to the idealised body of the productive artist, enshrined by the art institution. Her work, cleaning and scrubbing, caring and maintaining the architecture of the museum, formalises the debt-to-credit relationship between her, the artist, and the institution. The sculptural quality here is the volume between these two parties and the enormous scale of the confrontation. Using this space lent to her for the duration of the commission, Ukele carries out the work of the unseen, the unnamed, who care for the architecture and materiality of the body of the museum. Her ability to identify this realm of credit foregrounds the affect of these immaterial relations upon the body and the institution's relation as creditor. In Touch Sanitation from 1979 to 1980, Ukele's met more than 8,500 sanitation workers in the New York Sanitation Department, greeting them each with a handshake and the words which kind of transform into a speech act. I quote, "Thank you for keeping New York City alive." Today, the formal space and materiality of our infrastructure is increasingly implicit. Its physical realm is that of the cavities between walls, holding pipelines, cabling, and insulation foam. It is the realm of meters, acres, kilometers of vehicular material, and stations of server farms in remote places, carrying and containing the pulses of power, resulting in the distinctly underwhelming simplicity of the turn of a tap, the flick of a switch, the turning of the dial, and now the stroke of a screen. Conventionally, infrastructure has enabled bodies to live, providing the resources already assumed to be the basis of continuation of life. The period of financialization, beginning in the 1960s, placed debt within the realm of infrastructure. Following Keynesian economic policies of large borrowing to finance extensive post-war rebuilding projects, over the following decades, debt moves from an undesirable personal status to a state-mandated economic policy, and it becomes the way out of stagnation and the key for economic and cultural stimulation. Now, nation states had, of course, borrowed money prior to this. England, for example, had borrowed money since the 1600s as a nation state. And this was a way of financing expensive wars and generally overseas speculation and colonization. Personal debt, however, had carried huge moral stigma and was systematically legislated against. Indeed, in the UK, debtors actually could be sent to prison for non-payment and loans until the 20th century. But in this legal structure, the body is the ultimate collateral. the withdrawal of its freedom being the final redemption of the loan and the price paid. Death, the total and final absence of the body, is also another route out of the debt, as the contractual agreement ends upon this cessation. We can understand the complex psychological and somatic tie debt holds upon the body from this historical development of debt. Restoring oneself into credit is to restore the body to wholeness and to freedom, cleansing it from the guilt of being a debtor. Indeed, just yesterday, a friend asked me if I owned or leased my car, and my knee-jerk reaction was to insist on my total ownership of the car, even though the truth is I've still got some payments to make on it. The hallowed ground of personal security is full ownership of all assets. And in the UK, paying off your mortgage is a significant economic achievement that many people still aspire to. Achieving this by the age of 60 upon retirement is the moment secure life can begin. And up until this moment, you are working to achieve this security on a month-by-month basis. Mortgages are often posed in the vocabulary as personal investments. And as debt products have evolved over the decades to become more freely available, easier to attain, and more tied into our own personal infrastructure, debt has carried with it its psychological and somatic dimensions. From the mobile phone contract to a mortgage product to the broadband connection, we are borrowing our access to resources, which facilitates our survival. For those bodies who are unrecognized legally, socially, economically, access to these credit agreements prevents access to infrastructure absolutely necessary for gaining employment, welfare help, education, and advice. Unable to obtain a phone contract or broadband creates an underclass of citizens precluded from key resources. An infrastructure facilitated by debt compounds the social immobility by relegating those without access to credit into the lowest paid, invisible and precarious scenarios. The writing of process that debt maps out the bodies within each party to that process. Under these circumstances, the body must find spaces with which to recuperate agency. Debt products find the material expression in agreements, contracts, traditionally written on paper and signed by the parties. This is increasingly delivered as a PDF or as a link to a scroll down document you do not even read. You just click and agree. Adrian Piper's performance work, The Mythic Being and I Am the Locus, which these few slides kind of show documentation of, locates the marginalized body within this discussion of infrastructure, addressing the role of debt and guilt implicit to race and gender relations. This is fundamentally expressed in the contract of indenture, which characterizes the administrative execution of the slave trade. These works present these understandings of the affect upon the body with startling prescience. I'm just going to show you some of these. But it is Piper's tireless undertaking as guardian, archivist, and administrator of her work which presents a further insight into the bureaucratic dimension that one is required to engage in, perhaps to be free. With increased attention in the 80s and 90s, Piper undertook a rigorous defense of her work in extensive letters and essays in response to reviews and writings about her work. And I quote from a piece by Yanya Lee, published in Flash Art from 2018. Piper persistently refused, and I quote, the rampant factual misrepresentation of her work that sought to rectify these misinterpretations. Piper carefully itemizes the use of violent language and rhetoric, which manifests in most cases as unsupported claims and arguments, does not distinguish between the work of art and the artists themselves, and, oblique or, is informed by a stereotype associated with the artist's ability, gender, race, or sexuality. And then this is a quote from Piper. I was the first and only African-American woman artist given serious and sustained recognition by the mainstream art world. So I recognize the necessity of this task as part of the price of breaking ground, close quote. In 2013, Piper requested that the footage of Mythic Being be removed from the exhibition titled Radical Presence, Black Performance in Contemporary Art at NYU's Gray Art Galleries. The monitor was turned off and the gallery posted a note to viewers on top. and it explained that the artist had articulated her reasons in correspondence with the show's curator, Valerie Cassel-Oliver, which reads in part, quote, "I appreciate your intentions. Perhaps a more effective way to celebrate me, my work, and my contributions to not only the art world at large, but also a generation of Black artists working in performance might be to curate multi-ethnic exhibitions that give American audiences the rare opportunity to measure directly the groundbreaking achievements of African American artists against those of their peers in the art world at large," close quote. Through this administrative tool, Piper refuses her body and work from entering a debtor-creditor complex. It's no coincidence that the works cited today in this presentation are those of women and Black artists. These are the tools of marginalized bodies affected by debt and guilt complexes. And these artists had direct experience on their bodies within this complex and felt its somatic effect comprehended through their bodies as material. But it is within the realm of art that there may be potential to navigate these dimensions of scale, materiality, and immateriality. How does debt and guilt operate simultaneously at global and individual scale, for example? Oh, that's a terrible slide. Sorry about that. This is John Knight's work from titled World Debt, and it was first shown in 1994 at Xavier Hufkin's gallery. And it displays a bespoke credit card for each country of the world. The card number reads the national debt of the country to the World Bank at that time and the date that it was first issued. Here is Afghanistan's entry. Later, the work is shown at Richard Teller's Fine Art Gallery in 2003, and the cards reflect the change in total debt, often more, rarely less. The work presents the paradox of scale involved in national debt and that of personal responsibility in the form of a wallet-sized credit card. Looking at this work, I was reminded of a collaboration between Bono and American Express in the red and the American Express, this red American Express card. At the time of release in 2006, Bono explained, "A new American Express credit card is bright red and sexy. The sexy Amex Red card provides 1% of all proceeds towards fighting AIDS. This isn't the first red product, but it's the most financial, and based on that, I would hope that these might have more of a potential to make an impact." He further noted, "This is really sexy to me. It is sexy to want to change the world. The Amex Red card reverse side carries the statement, this card is designed to eliminate HIV in Africa." Should be noted that Bono's personal fortune is currently somewhere between $700 and $750 million. So staged in, again in the Paris in 2019, Knight's work has gathered the evolving dimensions of world and personal debt, guilt and responsibility. The flimsy plastic, graphic design and embossed numbers belies the enormity of the financial infrastructure, world markets, realpolitik and fiduciary inequality producing this gesture. It is physically flimsy, and yet it is a firm key for consequences and affect of a real life. Here in the gallery, it also enters into another realm of value as artwork, which is both financial product for speculation and surplus value. And as debt develops within the increasingly financialized conditions of society, culture, the art world, health, labor, and education, art practices around where this can be approached in formal terms to explicate its imperceptible operations. But also it operates within a highly speculative asset market of the art world. And perhaps these are the most apt conditions from which to describe, recognize, and recode debt and responsibility, precisely because they are on the cliff face. That's probably a question for discussion. Most recently, the global pandemic has cracked open many of these operations within infrastructure and resources. But debt's dexterous and polyvalent operation is not limited here to fundamental access to resources. The collaboration between Bono and Red American Express shows how contemporary debt is tightly wound into the mechanism of culture. Perhaps this can be understood through Lacan's notion of jouissance, the eternal searching for satisfaction of desire following the castration of the subject. But in the financialization of almost every aspect of infrastructure, and where culture and leisure is firmly part of this infrastructure, castration has been negated. Nothing is taboo, there is no ground beyond, and desire is more of a supermarket of combinations and rearrangements. Sanitizing taboo is in this way, and aligning personal freedom with how far one goes into the illusion of taboo, has paved the way for debt's unfettered infiltration into desire and culture. This is also the mechanism that enables debt and guilt to enter hitherto forbidden territory, territory which became a financial market. Most saliently seen in the 60s, what were once radical countercultures and experiments in alternative living are now lifestyle choices, purchased and worn and discarded. This is the psychological basis for what is perceived change and disallows the space for thinking through the implementation of real infrastructural change. You can spend on your credit card, and the paradox of contributing to cure HIV in Africa in the process is offered as a reward for this debt and the sating of personal desire. Win-win. Indeed, it could be argued that all of culture is by now an indebted superstructure. So how does one find agency within this? And also, is it the responsibility of art to try and attempt to consider that proposal, that question? Felix Guattari was interested in semiotic processes that function without the need to say anything at all. For example, both genetic code and computer code operate by the use of signs, but do not express any sense that exists outside of themselves. In his essay, Machine and Structure, Guattari borrows selectively from Lacanian terminology to name this a signifying and essentially schizophrenic process. And Sauvagnargues sums up this interrelation between Guattari's Marxist reading of history and his anti-structural project when she writes, quote, "It is with this feature of the relations of production in mind, namely the way they induce modes of subjectivation, that Guattari, a Marxist and a therapist, orientates his critique of the structure." Debt is the ultimate subjectivation machine, as it combines a signifying language with signifying language. And this is where the machine and structure are no longer differentiated in contemporary conditions. As soon as debt entered so seamlessly, so pleasantly into the technological age, a signifying language became entirely a process of referring to lived experiences. I actually like this work from Michael Marjoris. It's titled, "If We Are Dead, So It Is." And this is the installation view from the year 2000 at the Kunstverein, Kölnische Kunstverein Cologne. And it's interesting to me that he pictorially lays out this condition as a sort of almost like a branding exercise on a skate ramp. And then here there's just this person kind of skating and riding on top of it, which at one time would have been a kind of counterculture activity. Samo Tomzic offers that the process of recovery could lie precisely in the radical project of psychoanalysis. And just to end with a quote from him, "Only if we think of capitalist abstractions in their relation to the subject they produce, labour power, indebted subject, can we understand the interdependency of excessive wealth and excessive misery, profit and debt, surplus and lack. This relation indeed situates all inhabitants of the capitalist universe in the position of indebted subjects. This is your mission, should you choose to accept it."